Hey, everybody, we're going to move into our panel discussion right now. So I want to let you know if you have questions that came up from watching the film, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many of those as possible. But in the meantime, let me just introduce who we have with us tonight. I'll start with Ruth Taube. She is an attorney who has just an incredible wealth of knowledge that astounds me always. And she's with the Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center and the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. We also have Perla Flores. She's like a shining light in the world of victim service provision, and she's with Community Solutions and the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. Jennifer Huang is with us. She is the brilliant filmmaker who directed and produced the movie we just watched, This Adventure Called California. And interpreting for us tonight for Arnoldo, who is the one whose story we just saw in the film, is Tatiana. And so we're going to jump in and start with Jennifer. So Jennifer, as the director producer of the film that we just watched, would you tell us how you heard about Arnoldo's story?
Yes. Can you hear me? So I actually have been making a film about sex trafficking survivors in the Philippines called The Long Rescue. And doing research for that film, I learned about labor trafficking and how it doesn't get nearly as much attention, but there are an estimated 16 million people worldwide in labor trafficking. So when the opportunity came up for me to make a short film, I knew I wanted to focus on a labor trafficking survivor, and I started reaching out to different agencies that work with survivors. And Arnoldo stood out because most survivors didn't want to be in a film. And he was willing to put himself out there, and he wanted to share his story because he still feels outrage about the injustice he experienced and wants to work against that.
Jennifer, can you tell us then, what do you feel like you would like people to take away from hearing Arnoldo's story and watching your film?
I think people still are not necessarily aware that labor trafficking is something that happens here in the US. So I want people to know that it's happening and it's relevant to all of us. And I hope this prompts people to question the labor practices that they do interact with, whether it's hiring a gardener or someone they're hiring in their own company, or the products that they buy, and thinking about, was this sustainably and ethically made or not? So yeah, and we know that in the clothing industry, the chocolate industry, coffee, that there is a lot of exploitation, but there also are a lot of fair trade alternatives. And so that's a good place to start if you want to try to be living more sustainably. And my dream is that people will start demanding that workers are treated fairly as a condition of buying a good or a service, and that will push industries to change their practices towards workers.
Thanks, Jennifer. Let's turn to Ruth. Although human trafficking awareness has grown, there's still a lot of misconceptions about it. So Ruth, if you could help us with a bit of a definition of human trafficking so we can make sure we're all on the same page as we continue this discussion, that'd be great.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Human trafficking is recruiting, harboring, providing, or obtaining a person by force, fraud, or coercion for labor or services for the purpose of exploiting them, which means making money off them, involuntary servitude, forcing them to work for them or serve them against their will, debt bondage, which is they're told they have to keep working to work off a debt, slavery, or commercial sex. Force, fraud, and coercion aren't necessary for commercial sex involving a minor. There's no such thing as a child prostitute legally. In the state of California, it's substantial and sustained deprivation of liberty.
Ruth, sometimes the crime of human smuggling gets confused with human trafficking. Could you help clarify that for us?
Sure, that's a really common misconception. Smuggling is a crime against a border, and uh, and trafficking is really forcing someone to work or engage in commercial sex against their will. That isn't happening when you're moving someone. Movement is not necessary for trafficking. But sometimes after the person is smuggled into where they're going, trafficking can take place when they're forced to work or engage in commercial sex against their will.
Thanks for clarifying that, Ruth. We had some technical difficulties with Arnoldo, but I think he's back with us. There he is. So I'd like to go to the star of the film tonight. And Arnoldo, in the film, you mentioned that you like to watch documentaries, and you watched one about slavery, and you said that I'm educated and intelligent. That will never happen to me. Can you tell us, when did you realize you were a victim of human trafficking?
I can read nothing. Sorry.
Can you hear Tatiana?
I can read Tatiana. Sorry.
Creo que está. ¿Es it okay if I jump in?
Yes.
Creo que está intentando está preguntando que usted mencionó que usted va a ver muchos documentales y que había visto un documental acerca de trata de personas. ¿Y en qué momento se da cuenta usted que es víctima de trata de personas?
Oh, pues efectivamente, estaba con mi madre viendo un documental, un noticiero acerca de una situación de tráfico, y yo dije, eso a mí nunca me va a pasar porque yo fui a la escuela y soy una persona educada. Y no pasó un año y estaba yo ya metido en la trama del tráfico. Impensable para mí.
Y, no sé si Tatiana, si puedas ahorita hablar, si no estoy. So, Arnoldo is saying that he was with his mom watching a news report about human trafficking, and he thought that's never going to happen to me because I'm educated, I went to school, and 1 year later he was fully immersed in a trauma of human trafficking.
Thank you. Tatiana, do we have you back? Can you hear us? If not, I'm glad we have a little backup here with Perla. One more question for Arnoldo. What would you like people to, what would you like other victims or survivors of labor trafficking to know?
Arnoldo, ¿qué le gustaría a usted que supieran otras víctimas de trata de personas y particularmente en explotación de labor? ¿Qué le gustaría que supieran?
Oh, pues primero que defiendan su autoestima. Primero que deben de cuidar mucho su autoestima, que se lo van a pisotear y se lo van a hacer basura, pero tienen que defenderlo porque después de eso, de levantarse ya es muy difícil. Aunque no imposible, ¿no? Pero es difícil. Cuesta mucho trabajo.
Muchas gracias. Arnoldo is saying that he would tell survivors of human trafficking to protect and defend your self-esteem above everything else. Take care of your self-esteem because it's going to be trampled on, and the traffickers will make you feel like you're trash and you're not worth anything. And it's really very challenging to recover after that kind of experience. So very important to protect your self-esteem and your sense of self-worth. Gracias, Arnoldo.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you. Perla, let's go to you because I think there are times when people wonder why, if someone's not locked up or chained to something, why they don't just walk away. So could you explain a little bit some of the dynamics that keep people from when they're being exploited, what keeps them from leaving or calling law enforcement?
Sure, and there's so many different situations that are different, but we've seen situations where the survivor, in many of the cases, the survivors know their traffickers. Often their family members, their partners, their family, their friends are from back home, and so they don't have anywhere to go. We saw in Arnoldo's case that he was relying on his trafficker for food and for a place to live. And also, we've heard from Arnoldo's case that he was ashamed to leave and go back home and feel like that he had failed. So exploiters know that the situations, the vulnerable situations that victims are in, and often all they have to use is coercive tactics and manipulation to keep them controlled and to keep them in that fear and not wanting to leave this, the situation. Also for fear of what's going to happen. Am I going to be deported? And am I going to be living on the streets? Which unfortunately was what happened to Arnoldo.
Yeah, thanks, Perla. Let's go back to Ruth. We just talked and saw about some of the things that made Arnoldo vulnerable. And we see trafficking in many different ways, but could you share a little bit more about who's the most vulnerable to trafficking and some of the reasons that make them vulnerable?
Certainly. Recent migration or relocation, substance use, runaway homeless youth, mental health concerns, people that are involved in the child welfare system. Also, they look for people that are undocumented, unaccompanied minors, people with recruitment debt, isolated people, poverty, LGBTQIA plus that are estranged from their families, and the missing and murdered Indigenous Native American women. But it could happen to anybody.
Yeah, thanks. So there are all kinds of things that make someone vulnerable, and we do see it happening in many different faces. We've been talking a little bit about why it occurs and how it happens. Let's go back to Perla and talk about what happens to someone after they've come out of the trauma of being exploited in a trafficking situation. So survivors of human trafficking have a long road of recovery ahead of them. So can you tell us about what kind of support and services are available for them?
Absolutely. It's really important to provide comprehensive services for survivors from crisis identification until somebody is able to establish stability and sustain that stability. And that usually takes an average of 3 to 5 years. And particularly when we're working with foreign-born survivors that are waiting for some type of immigration relief. So different counties have different types of services available. But what's really important is to be able to provide that housing. Again, we saw Arnoldo struggling to without housing, living under a bridge, to provide food assistance, provide assistance. Survivors of human trafficking that are foreign-born particularly are eligible for benefits that include emergency Medi-Cal, cash assistance, food assistance. And so all of those services provided by victim service providers, and also the collaboration with other agencies like legal service providers to make sure that the immigration piece is taken care of. If there's issues around employment law, it's really a collaborative effort, and it takes a village to provide that comprehensive support for such a long period of time.
Yeah, thanks. We've got a question for Arnoldo that I'll jump to in a minute, but Perla, just to follow up, what about for people who don't speak English? What does that look like for services?
That's a really good question. And we live in such a diverse area, so it's really important to have those partnerships with other service providers that that speak different languages. And in worst case scenario, we've had to use language lines. But it's also been really helpful for us to develop a survivor advisory council where we have survivors that speak different languages that can also help provide some of that interpretation support.
Thanks. So Arnoldo, we have a question that came in for you. Tatiana, did we get you back yet or not? Still don't think so.
Can you hear me? Oh my God.
Oh, wait, you're there.
Yes. You can hear me. Okay.
Yes. So this is the question. You see it in the chat. Can you tell us if there's anything you would have liked law enforcement to do differently regarding the interactions you had with them?
Arnoldo, esta es una pregunta para usted. ¿Puede decirnos si hay algo que le hubiera gustado que la policía hiciera de manera diferente con respecto a las interacciones que usted tuvo con ellos?
En el momento de, pues la verdad, estoy muy agradecido en lo que respecta a las personas que trabajaron en el caso. Estoy muy agradecido porque realmente, pues, vengo de México y allá la impunidad es bastante es bastante grande, ¿no? Y pues aquí se tardaron, pero fue real. Lamentablemente la persona pues ahorita ya está libre por errores que se hicieron, pero estuvo bien.
Arnoldo is grateful for the respect and the work that law enforcement was able to put into this case. Coming from Mexico, it's a bit different there. And even though it took a while here for the case to kind of move forward, I'm still incredibly grateful for the support that they were able to provide me.
That's good to hear. That's a good segue into, we saw the end. We saw in the film that, and let's go back to Ruth for this, since because of your familiarity with the case, we saw that the conviction of the trafficker was overturned. Do you have? Could you explain a little bit about that and any other updates about the case?
Yes, the conviction was overturned. The case was dismissed, and it was due to malfeasance that was unrelated to the merits of the case. But there is a civil case going on. The Department of Labor was involved. It was a federal case, and under state law, the survivors are entitled to more wages and penalties. And so there is a civil case going on right now in Alameda County. So I'm hopeful that the survivors will be able to recover.
Thanks for that update, Ruth. As we can see, the prosecuting cases and protecting the victims it's a complex process and sometimes takes some time. So as we are going to kind of go through some concluding comments, let's go back to Jennifer and just like to hear from you about, as you created this film and did your research, can you share something with us that really surprised you the most and you'd like to share with our audience tonight?
Yeah, one thing that really surprised me was how similar the impacts of the trauma were between the sex trafficking survivors that I work with and Arnoldo, specifically, as he mentioned, the crushing of your self-worth and your self-esteem. And so therefore the recovery process is equally challenging. And another thing that really struck me is that the things that make you vulnerable to trafficking don't disappear just because you've left that situation. You're still vulnerable. And so one small setback can unravel everything. And in Arnoldo's case, that the truck that we see in the film, it was actually stolen. And so he really, he was left without a home and a vehicle with that act. And we did actually have a GoFundMe, which thank you for posting the link. He was able to get a sort of a replacement vehicle, but that was in an accident. And so he now is needing like an actual, working vehicle. And so if you're interested in helping out, we have, you can go to the website and we can, and from there's a link to a GoFundMe page, and Perla, we can talk about other funding possibilities as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jennifer. That was very insightful. And I'm confident our other panelists would agree with the amount of trauma they've seen in trafficking cases and how often there are setbacks, that it's not a smooth road to recovery always. Perla, from the film, we saw that Arnoldo was trafficked in the construction industry, but this happens in many industries, I believe. So can you share with us where else we may see it, and how can people watching tonight be a part of identifying it in their communities?
Yeah, unfortunately, labor trafficking can happen in any industry. We've had cases of nannies that are trafficked. We've had cases of professors with doctorates that are trafficked and doing teaching work. We've had cases, many cases in the hospitality industry and working in hotels, working in restaurants. We've had cases of fruit vendors. We've had cases of ice cream vendors. And I think that it's really important to be alert in your surroundings. And if somebody looks like that they're afraid of their employer, if somebody looks like they don't have that freedom of movement, that they don't have agency, those are a lot of times telling. If somebody lives with their employer and their employer controls who that person can talk to on the phone, if they can have any company, if that employer is deducting certain things or never paying them, there's certainly a lot of red flags. So it's important to always keep our eyes open. In fact, with the case with the ice cream vendors, it was the neighbor. A neighbor saw that across the street, a van would pick up several men and take them to do work. And so that felt suspicious that they were out working like 12, 14 hours a day, that they seemed to always have their head down, and called the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And from that tip, those ice cream vendors of several were able to receive the support that they needed. So just always being alert is very important.
And I think that shows that why labor trafficking is often so hidden, because you can't just necessarily look at someone and identify them. So, but so you mentioned the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Do you have other suggestions if someone sees something suspicious? Are there local resources that you would point them to, Perla?
I think the National Human Trafficking Hotline is the best resource, because the National Human Trafficking Hotline is connected to every county, every service provider across the country. And so we've had referrals from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we are able to connect it. So that would be my number one resource. And absolutely, if you see somebody that's being hurt, then it's important to not put yourself in a situation of danger. And there's times that we do have to call 911 if we see somebody being hurt.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, it could be dangerous for you or for the person being trafficked if you were talking too much of them, because they are often being observed by their exploiters. Arnoldo, we've seen that many people are thankful that you're willing to share your story. Can we ask you a final question? What do you hope? Who do you hope will watch the film, and what do you want people to learn from it?
Arnoldo, tenemos una más pregunta para usted. ¿Quién esperas que vea la película y qué quieres que la gente aprende de ella?
Aprender. Pues que la vea quien tenga que verla, ¿verdad? Yo creo que todas las personas que están expuestas a ese tipo de situaciones, pues es bueno que la vean, pero yo siento que Arnoldo como una vida especial no tiene mucho que decir, pero en el caso del tráfico se debería tomar la experiencia de que una persona sufre, pues, ¿sí me explico? No sé si está bien con eso. No, permíteme, verás. Deja aclarar lo que quiero decir. Humildemente, siento que no soy una persona tan especial y tan importante como para que tu vida sea una película, como para que tu vida vaya a hacerse una película, ¿no? Para mí fue un halago muy grande por parte de Jennifer que me haya escogido a mí para eso. Pero hay muchas personas sufriendo una vida realmente espantosa por el tráfico. Yo tuve suerte, realmente yo tuve suerte, pero solamente lo mío, mi película es la punta del iceberg. Hay gente que está sufriendo, realmente sufriendo. Y eso me gustaría que la gente lo entendiera, pero ojalá y se pase el mensaje. Así.
Sorry, just taking some notes. So Arnoldo said whoever needs to watch it should watch it. All people who are like susceptible to these situations can watch it. In case of trafficking, taking my experience that folks suffer from these situations. And then he wanted to clarify a little bit that humbly he doesn't feel like he's a special person, that his life should be a movie. For him, it was an amazing opportunity to be a part of Jennifer's film. There are so many other folks who are going through terrible and scary lives from being trafficked. But I hope that this movie highlights what so many other folks endure, and I hope that the message is able to spread.
Thank you, Arnoldo. I think, Arnoldo, your humility is obvious from the film. There's another question that came in before we wrap, though. I'm going to direct it to Ruth, but other panelists, please feel free to jump in. What strategies are available to reduce and prevent labor trafficking from occurring? I know that it's complex, but can you help shed light into that?
Well, labor trafficking, the purpose of labor trafficking is basically to exploit someone, and it involves wage theft. It's a lot greater usually, because the wage theft cases we see are typically not paying overtime, not paying minimum wage. But in labor trafficking cases, it's extreme. I mean, you see people getting almost no money. You saw it in the film, and starving. And so it's important, I think, for local governments to put in place, and for agencies like the Department of Labor, alcohol, beverage, etc., to make sure that their investigators are on the lookout. It's also a public health issue as well, and so it's important when there's inspections for these investigators to really look, and for people themselves to be aware. In one of the trainings I did, someone said there was a mirrored wall in a convenience store, and there were a number of cots. An alcohol beverage control person happened to see a mattress on the floor over some pallets, and became suspicious that the person was living there. So I think it's important that we all keep our eyes open, and particularly people in local governments, investigators, people who go into houses to look for code violations, etc., to be on the lookout. Also, bus drivers, Uber drivers, people who interface with the public should keep their eyes open as well.
Thanks, Ruth. Perla, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Ruth did a beautiful job. The only thing that I would say is that I think it's really important to address labor trafficking as a public health issue, and make sure that we're targeting like individuals, families, and communities. And so we do that through involving community members, training the promotoras or community peer educators, and for them to go back into their communities and in a way that feels safe, share what labor trafficking is, and share what the resources are to start dispelling some of the misinformation that traffickers are putting out there to keep individuals in those exploitative situations.
Thanks. So there are resources available for those who are at risk for being exploited. We've also been dropping a lot of resources in the chat for you tonight. And so before we wrap up, any panelists want to point out any particular resources that you'd like to highlight?
We have a legal advice line in English, Spanish, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and Mandarin, and there's attorneys on there. It's free for anyone in the whole state, including San Mateo County. And we screen for human trafficking as well. And the number is 888-3, that's the human trafficking, 866-870-7725. I think I reflexively give the human trafficking hotline number. I think if you woke me up, I'd say it in my sleep. 866-870-7725 is the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement legal advice line.
Thanks, Ruth. And you mentioned it's available in several languages.
It is English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Visayan, and Mandarin.
Great. Anybody else want to highlight any other of the resources that we've been talking about? Jennifer, you're at, there you go.
Yeah. So Cast LA is a anti-trafficking group down in Los Angeles, and they've been spearheading a move to close a loophole to help protect agricultural workers. And there's a link on my website. There's an online petition that you can sign, and you can also write a letter or an email to Gavin Newsom. Right now, he's saying that he will veto the legislation if it comes to his desk. And so we're hoping to make it known that we want it passed.
There's also a law federally that if you knew or should have known and financially benefited from the trafficking, you're liable civilly. And that would have been a good law here because the contractors obviously knew or should have known, but it's only in federal law. It's not in state law. So we'd like to see that in state law. It's used for sex trafficking against hotels and motels a lot, but I think it would be really good in construction for the contractor when you have a case like Arnoldo's where the subcontractor was the trafficker.
Yes, that's a good reminder that any of us who have a voice with our legislators at the state and the federal level can have an impact right away just by being educated about these types of bills and laws that are being discussed and sharing our voices with those who can create these legislation.
Yeah, we helped with the training bill for transit workers, and that is there. And also SB 1193, the poster that has to be up, they added hotels and motels. So there has been some progress, but of course we could use more.
Yeah, all those bills are helpful steps toward more robust legislation to really help address this issue. We're really kind of come up against time, so I just want to thank not only all of our panelists for being here, but all of you for joining us online. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tony to wrap this up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for the conversation. And Jennifer, congrats on the film. Arnoldo, thank you so much for sharing your story. And we know this film is going to be going out to other places. So if you are interested in finding where and how, make sure you go to treeclimbermedia.org. This link will delete. It's going to self-destruct as soon as we finish, but we will reshare this panel discussion on its own so that you can share that. You'll have all the resources that you can share and you'll see those, but we're really grateful. I know next it's going to be at CineQuest Film Festival in the Bay Area, April 1st through the 17th, so you can check it out there. And anybody else who has any comments or thoughts on this event, you can give me an email, tony@bravemaker.com, and I'll share them with this panel. And thank you to Pamela, who coordinated everything tonight. We want to make sure you come back on April 14th for our third and final documentary, the Boys documentary. Join us 1 month from tonight. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you soon. Brave stories change the world, and you are the story. We'll see you next time. Thank you.